The cane struck the marble floor, and the entire ballroom turned to look. Edmund Ashworth froze in the doorway, his hand tight around the silver handle, his jaw set hard against the pain that shot through his hip with every step. Behind him, the footman who had announced his name was already looking away, already pretending he had not seen the young Earl of Ravensmore stumble on the threshold like a man twice his age. Somewhere near the punch table, a young woman laughed behind her fan. She was not laughing at anything Edmund had said, because he had not said a word. She was laughing at him. Edmund kept his face still. He had learned, over 3 long years, exactly how to do that. He had learned to walk into a room full of strangers who had already decided what he was before he opened his mouth, and to let their whispers slide off him like rain off a closed window. Tonight would be no different. Tonight was a ball at Lord Pembroke's grand townhouse, one of the finest addresses in London, and Edmund had been invited only because his title demanded it. Everyone in that glittering room knew his name. Fewer of them remembered that he had once been the finest rider in 3 counties. That had ended on a wet October morning, when his horse missed its footing on a muddy hill and rolled onto his leg. Edmund remembered very little of the accident itself, only the sound the bone made, and the long weeks afterward, when the surgeon spoke to his mother in hushed tones outside his bedroom door, as though Edmund could not hear every word through the thin wall. He remembered the moment the surgeon told him, quite plainly, that he would never again walk without help. Edmund had been 22 years old. 3 years later, at 25, he still felt the eyes on him the moment he entered any room. Tonight those eyes belonged to Julian Thorne, a young viscount with golden hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, who stood near the fireplace with 2 of his usual companions. Edmund did not need to hear what Thorne said to know it was about him. He could see it in the way Thorne's mouth curled, in the way his friends glanced toward the doorway, and then quickly away, biting back their laughter. Edmund made his way along the edge of the room, choosing the path farthest from the dance floor, the path he always chose. A servant had already placed a chair for him near the wall, tucked half behind a large potted fern, as though someone had decided in advance that this was where a crippled earl belonged. Edmund lowered himself into it without complaint. He had stopped expecting anything else a long time ago. From his chair he could see the whole room. He watched young couples take their places for the next dance, watched mothers steer their daughters toward eligible gentlemen, watched the great chandeliers throw warm light over silk gowns and polished boots. It was a beautiful scene, and Edmund had once been part of it in every sense. He had danced. He had laughed without thinking about how his laugh might look to strangers. He had walked across a ballroom without a single person watching his feet. Now he sat in a chair by a fern and pretended he did not mind. Ravensmore. The voice was smooth, amused, and unmistakably Julian Thorne's. He had crossed the room with 2 of his friends trailing behind him, their faces already arranged into expressions of barely contained mirth. "I did not expect to see you tonight. I would have thought the walk from your carriage alone might exhaust a man in your condition." "Good evening, Thorne," Edmund said, keeping his voice even. He had long ago decided that the worst thing he could give men like Thorne was a reaction. "Tell me," Thorne continued, ignoring the greeting entirely, "do you still dream of dancing? I imagine it must be difficult, watching all of us enjoy something you can no longer have." One of Thorne's friends snickered. Edmund felt the familiar heat rise in his chest, the old anger that he had trained himself to swallow, because anger only ever made things worse. He thought of a dozen sharp replies, and said none of them. "I manage well enough," Edmund said simply. "Of course you do." Thorne's smile widened. "Forgive me. I only meant to be kind. It cannot be easy, being the man everyone whispers about. The Crippled Earl, they call you. Did you know that? I have heard it said in at least 3 drawing rooms this week alone." Edmund's fingers tightened around the head of his cane, but his face did not change. Across the room, he noticed a few heads turning toward the small scene unfolding by the fern, and he felt his cheeks grow warm despite himself. This was the part he hated most, not the insult itself, but the audience it gathered, the way a crowd of well-dressed strangers could watch a man be humiliated and do absolutely nothing to stop it. "If you will excuse me," Edmund said, and began the slow, careful process of rising from his chair. His hip protested with a sharp stab of pain, and for one terrible moment his cane slipped slightly on the polished floor. He caught himself before he fell, but not before Thorne's friends burst into open laughter. "Careful now," Thorne said, his voice dripping with false concern. "We would not want the Earl to end up flat on his back in front of all of London." Edmund said nothing. He simply turned, as steadily as he could manage, and made his way toward the terrace doors, desperate for air that did not smell of perfume and cruelty. Behind him, he heard Thorne's voice carry across the room, retelling the moment for anyone who had missed it, adding details that made it sound even more pitiful than it had been. More laughter followed. Edmund kept walking. He had almost reached the terrace when a firm hand caught his elbow, not to mock him, but to help. Edmund turned, startled, and found himself looking into a pair of clear gray eyes that he did not recognize. "You are walking too quickly for that floor," the woman said, quite matter of fact, as though she had not just witnessed the scene at the fireplace. "It has just been polished. Even I nearly lost my footing on it earlier, and I have both legs working perfectly well." Edmund blinked at her, unsure whether to be offended or grateful. She did not look away from him the way most people did, quickly, and with obvious discomfort. She looked at him directly, the way one looks at any other person in a room. "I am quite capable of walking on my own," Edmund said, more sharply than he intended. "I did not say you were not," the woman replied, releasing his elbow at once. "I only said the floor was slippery. Forgive me if kindness offends you, my lord. I shall try to be ruder in future." There was something in her tone, dry and unbothered, that caught Edmund entirely off guard. Most people who approached him did so with either pity dripping from every word, or with the same cruel amusement he had just endured by the fireplace. This woman offered neither. "I did not mean to be short with you," Edmund said after a moment. "I am simply not accustomed to strangers offering help without wanting something in return, or without wanting to be seen helping the poor crippled Earl." "I am not interested in being seen doing anything," the woman said. "My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I only arrived in London a fortnight ago, and I confess I have already grown tired of watching grown men behave like schoolyard bullies, while everyone else pretends not to notice." Edmund studied her more closely now. She wore a gown of deep green, simpler than most in the room, without the elaborate trimmings favored by the fashionable young women who filled Lord Pembroke's ballroom. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly, and there was a directness in her expression that he found strangely unsettling, as though she could see straight through the careful mask he wore. "You saw what happened then," Edmund said quietly. "I saw a man mock another man for something entirely beyond his control, and I saw a room full of people find it entertaining," Eleanor said. "I do not particularly care for entertainment of that kind. Most people find it easier not to notice." "Most people are cowards," Eleanor said simply, without malice, as though she were merely stating a fact about the weather. "I am told that is the fashionable way to behave in London society. I have not yet decided whether I intend to be fashionable." Despite himself, Edmund felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward, the first genuine impulse toward a smile he had felt all evening. "That is a dangerous thing to admit at a ball full of fashionable people, Miss Whitfield." "I have never much cared for danger," Eleanor said, "or rather, I have decided that being laughed at for saying what I believe is a far smaller danger than staying silent while cruelty goes unanswered." Edmund did not know how to respond to that. He had grown so used to silence, his own and everyone else's, that her words landed with unexpected weight. He studied her face for any sign of pity, the thing he dreaded most, and found none. There was only that same steady, curious attention, as though she genuinely wished to understand who he was, rather than simply what had happened to his leg. "You are very direct, Miss Whitfield," he said finally. "I have been told it is one of my worst qualities," she replied, "along with an unfortunate habit of speaking my mind at precisely the moments other people would prefer I stayed quiet." "I find I do not mind it," Edmund admitted, somewhat surprised at himself. "Then perhaps you are the first person in this room tonight with good sense," Eleanor said, and there was warmth in her voice now, a hint of humor that had not been there before. "Though I confess I have only been in London a fortnight, so my sample of good sense may be rather small." They stood together near the terrace doors for a long moment, and for the first time that evening, Edmund did not feel the weight of 100 watching eyes. He felt, instead, that he was simply speaking with another person, one who saw him, and not merely the cane in his hand, or the story people told about him behind their fans. "I should return to the dance floor before my absence is noted," Eleanor said eventually, though she did not move at once. "My aunt worries terribly when she cannot see me, for more than a quarter of an hour." She is convinced I shall wander off and disgrace the family somehow. Given what I have witnessed of your conversation, Miss Whitfield, I suspect your aunt has reason to worry, Edmund said. And this time he did smile, just slightly. Perhaps, Eleanor said, smiling back, though I would rather disgrace my family by speaking honestly than please them by staying silent while a bully has his fun. Good evening, Lord Ravensmore. I hope the rest of your night proves less tiresome than its beginning. She inclined her head and moved back toward the ballroom, leaving Edmund alone by the terrace doors, with a strange, unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize what it was. Not pity, and not the numb resignation he had carried for 3 years. It was something closer to hope, small and cautious, the kind he had long ago told himself not to trust. He watched her disappear into the crowd, and for the first time since his accident, Edmund found himself wondering if perhaps not everyone in London society had already decided who he was. Behind him, through the open terrace doors, the music began again, bright and full of laughter, and Edmund remained where he stood a while longer, in no hurry to return to the room, where Julian Thorne was no doubt already retelling the story of the crippled Earl who had nearly fallen on the ballroom floor. Edmund found, to his own surprise, that he minded a little less than he had an hour before. Across the garden, the last of the sunset caught the edge of the clouds, turning them a deep gold, and somewhere inside the house, a woman with clear gray eyes and no patience for cruelty was dancing among people who had no idea she had just changed something in a man they had all decided to overlook. The weeks that followed brought no shortage of cruelty, though Edmund found he noticed it differently now, the way a man notices a familiar ache once someone else has pointed it out to him. He attended a garden party at the home of Lady Sinclair, a woman famous for her roses and her sharp tongue, and within an hour of his arrival, he overheard 2 young gentlemen wagering on how many steps he could manage before needing to rest. They did not lower their voices. They did not seem to think it mattered whether he heard them, as though his hearing, like his leg, had also been damaged in the accident. Edmund walked past them without a word, though his hand shook slightly around the handle of his cane, and he spent the remainder of the afternoon seated beneath a willow tree, watching the party continue without him. He attended a dinner at Lord Fairweather's townhouse, where his hostess, in what she no doubt believed was an act of great consideration, seated him at the very end of the table, farthest from the other guests, so that he would not, in her words, feel obligated to rise and greet anyone during the meal. Edmund understood the arrangement for what it was. He was easier to manage from a distance. He was easier to forget. He attended a musical evening, where a young soprano sang beautifully, for nearly an hour, and afterward, when the guests rose to applaud, Edmund remained seated, because rising and clapping at once required more balance than he could safely manage while holding his cane. A woman 2 seats away leaned toward her companion and murmured something about how strange it was that the Earl of Ravensmore could not even stand for a proper ovation. Edmund heard every word. It had been 3 years of evenings like these, and Edmund had built, brick by careful brick, a wall around the part of himself that used to hope for anything better. He told himself it was easier this way. If he expected nothing from a room full of strangers, then nothing they said or did could truly wound him. It was not entirely true, of course. Every unkind word still found its mark somewhere beneath his ribs, but he had grown skilled at not letting it show, and for 3 years, that skill had been enough to get him through each evening intact. What he had not expected was how much harder it became to maintain that wall once someone had shown him a glimpse of what lay on the other side of it. He saw Eleanor Whitfield again at Lady Sinclair's garden party, standing near the roses with a small group of young women, and though she did not approach him directly, their eyes met once across the lawn, and she offered him a small, private smile, the kind that suggested she remembered their conversation on the terrace and had not forgotten a single word of it. Edmund found himself smiling back before he could stop himself, and for the rest of the afternoon, even seated alone beneath his willow tree, he did not feel quite as invisible as he usually did. He saw her again a week later at a card party hosted by his own aunt, Lady Margaret Ashworth, a formidable woman who had taken it upon herself to reintroduce Edmund gently to society after his accident, though her efforts had met with limited success. Eleanor was seated at a table not far from his, and though the rules of the game kept them from speaking at length, she made a point of catching his eye whenever something amusing occurred, sharing the small joke with him across the room, as though he were simply another guest, and not a curiosity to be managed and pitied. It was a small thing. It should not have mattered as much as it did. But Edmund found himself thinking of those brief exchanged glances for days afterward, turning them over in his mind, the way a man examines a coin he has found in an old coat pocket, uncertain of its value but reluctant to set it aside. Julian Thorne, for his part, seemed to have taken a particular interest in Edmund's continued suffering, as though the Earl's disability were a source of endless personal entertainment that never quite lost its appeal. Thorne was the second son of an Earl himself, though his own father held considerably more land and influence than Edmund's modest estate could claim, and there was, Edmund suspected, some deeper resentment buried beneath Thorne's cruelty, some old grievance about titles and inheritances that had nothing at all to do with Edmund's leg, and everything to do with Thorne's own disappointments. Understanding this did not make the cruelty easier to bear, it simply gave it a shape. At a ball hosted by the Duke of Ashcombe, Thorne outdid himself. He arranged, through some quiet word to the musicians, for a particular dance to be called just as Edmund was making his way across the room, a lively reel that required quick footwork and constant motion, the very sort of dance Edmund could no longer safely attempt. Thorne then made a great show of approaching Edmund in front of a crowd of onlookers and asking, with exaggerated concern, whether the Earl of Ravensmore intended to join the dance, or whether he would prefer, as always, to watch from the sidelines like a spectator at his own life. Edmund felt the old anger rise in his chest, sharper this time, and for one dangerous moment, he considered saying something he would later regret. But before he could speak, a voice cut through the small crowd, clear and unhurried. "How curious," Eleanor Whitfield said, appearing seemingly from nowhere at Edmund's side, "that you should concern yourself so deeply with Lord Ravensmore's dancing, Lord Thorne, when I have heard from several reliable sources that your own footwork leaves a great deal to be desired. I understand you trod on poor Miss Carrington's slipper not once but twice at the Pembroke ball." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the small crowd, and Thorne's face flushed an unbecoming shade of red. "That is hardly the same matter, Miss Whitfield." Eleanor tilted her head, her expression one of polite confusion, as though she genuinely could not follow his reasoning. "You seem to believe that a man who cannot dance well deserves to be mocked publicly for it. I only wondered whether you held yourself to the same standard, or whether the rule applies only to men whose difficulties happen to be visible to the eye." Thorne opened his mouth, closed it again, and seemed unable to find a response sharp enough to salvage the moment. His friends, sensing the tide had turned against him, offered no support, their eyes darting uncomfortably between Thorne and Eleanor, as though eager to distance themselves from whatever had just occurred. "If you will excuse us," Eleanor said pleasantly, "Lord Ravensmore was just telling me about his interest in horse breeding before you interrupted, and I find myself quite eager to hear the rest." She turned, without waiting for Thorne's response, and walked toward the refreshment table, leaving Edmund no choice but to follow, which he did, his cane tapping against the floor in a rhythm that felt, for once, less like a mark of shame, and more like the simple sound of a man walking wherever he pleased. "You did not need to do that," Edmund said quietly, once they were out of earshot of the small crowd. "I did not need to," Eleanor agreed, "but I wanted to. There is a difference, my lord, though I find most people confuse the two." "He will only find some other way to make himself feel clever at my expense," Edmund said. "Men like Thorne always do." "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but he will think twice before doing it in front of me again, and that is something, even if it is not everything." Edmund studied her for a long moment, this strange, direct young woman who seemed entirely unbothered by the disapproving glances a few nearby guests were casting in her direction, whispering no doubt about her boldness in speaking so freely to a viscount, and her boldness in defending a man society had already dismissed. "You will earn yourself a reputation, Miss Whitfield," he said, "if you continue defending crippled earls at every ball you attend." "I have already earned a reputation," Eleanor said, with a small, unbothered shrug. "My aunt tells me daily that I am too outspoken, too stubborn, and entirely unsuited to fashionable society. I find I do not mind it nearly as much as she hopes I will." "And what reputation would you prefer instead?" Eleanor considered this for a moment, her gray eyes thoughtful. "I think I would prefer to be known as someone who tells the truth, even when it is inconvenient, rather than someone who says pleasant things to everyone's face and unkind things behind their backs. I have met enough of the second kind since arriving in London to last me a lifetime. Edmund found himself, once again, without a ready response. There was something in the plain honesty of her words that unsettled the careful walls he had built around himself, not by tearing them down all at once, but by finding, quietly and persistently, the small cracks where light might eventually get through. "I did not tell you about my interest in horse breeding," he said finally, remembering her earlier words to Thorn. "No," Eleanor agreed, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "But I understand you have quite an excellent stable at Ravensmoor, even if you no longer ride yourself. I thought it might be a more interesting topic than watching Lord Thorn make a fool of himself in front of half of London. You seem to know a great deal about my estate, for a woman who has been in London only a fortnight. I make it a point to learn about the people I intend to speak with," Eleanor said simply. "It saves a great deal of awkward silence." Edmund laughed then, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both, and for the remainder of the evening, though Thorn kept a careful distance, and the rest of London society continued its familiar whispers, Edmund found that he did not much mind. He had, for the first time in 3 years, a reason to look forward to the next ball, and it had nothing to do with duty or obligation, and everything to do with the possibility of seeing Eleanor Whitfield again. Yet even as the evening drew to its close, and Edmund made his slow way toward his carriage, he could not shake a small, uneasy thought. Julian Thorn was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and the public embarrassment Eleanor had dealt him tonight was the sort of wound that men like Thorn rarely forgot, and even more rarely forgave. News of the exchange between Eleanor Whitfield and Julian Thorn spread through London society faster than either of them could have expected, and by the following morning, Eleanor's aunt, Lady Beatrice Compton, had heard no fewer than 4 different versions of the story, each one more dramatic than the last. "You humiliated a viscount in front of half the Duke of Ashcombe's guests," Lady Beatrice said, pacing the length of her drawing room, while Eleanor sat calmly with a cup of tea, entirely unbothered by her aunt's evident distress. "Do you understand what you have done, Eleanor? Men like Thorn do not forget such things. He will make your life very difficult if you continue on this path." "He was being cruel to a man who had done nothing to deserve it," Eleanor said. "I do not see what else I was meant to do, Aunt. Stand there and say nothing while he mocked Lord Ravensmoor in front of the entire room? That is precisely what everyone else does," Lady Beatrice said, exasperated. "That is how society functions, my dear. One does not draw attention to oneself by defending strangers, however unfairly they may be treated." "Then I do not much care for how society functions," Eleanor said simply, and took a sip of her tea. Lady Beatrice sighed, the particular sigh of a woman who had raised her niece from the age of 12, and had long ago accepted that Eleanor's stubbornness was not a habit that could be trained out of her. Eleanor's parents had died when she was young, her father lost to a fever, and her mother following only 2 years later, leaving Eleanor in the care of her father's sister, a kind but perpetually anxious woman who had never quite understood how to manage a niece who seemed to have inherited none of the family's usual caution. "He is not a stranger to you now, at least," Lady Beatrice said, softening slightly. "Lord Ravensmoor, I mean. You have spoken with him twice now, by my count." "3 times, Eleanor corrected, and something in her voice made her aunt look at her more closely. "Eleanor. It is nothing, Aunt. I simply find him more interesting than most of the gentlemen I have met since arriving in London. He does not flatter me, and he does not pretend to be something he is not. That alone sets him apart from nearly every other man at these balls. He is an earl, with a limp, and a small estate in the countryside," Lady Beatrice said carefully. "He is not, I think, the sort of match your uncle had in mind when he brought you to London this season." "I am not thinking of matches, Aunt. I am thinking of a man who has been treated unkindly for 3 years, by people who have no right to judge him, and I find I would rather spend an evening in his company than in the company of men like Lord Thorn, whose only accomplishment appears to be cruelty, dressed up in fine clothing." Lady Beatrice said nothing further on the matter that morning, though Eleanor noticed, in the weeks that followed, a certain watchfulness in her aunt's eyes whenever Edmund Ashworth's name was mentioned in conversation. For his part, Edmund found himself thinking of Eleanor Whitfield far more often than he cared to admit, even to himself. He had spent 3 years training his mind away from hope, the way one might train a nervous horse away from a particular sound that startled it, and yet here he was, finding excuses to attend gatherings he would once have avoided entirely, simply for the chance that she might be there. He saw her again, at a poetry reading hosted by Lady Sinclair, a considerably quieter affair than the balls and dinners that usually filled his calendar, and this time, without the noise and crowd of a full ballroom, they found themselves able to speak at length for nearly an hour, seated in a small alcove near the window, while the other guests listened to a young poet recite verses about love and loss. "You do not attend many balls, I think, without some particular reason," Eleanor observed, watching him carefully. "You seem far more at ease here, away from the dancing." "I attend because duty requires it," Edmund admitted. "As Earl, certain obligations cannot be avoided, however much I might prefer to remain at Ravensmoor with my books and my horses." "Tell me about your horses," Eleanor said, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice, not the polite interest people sometimes feigned, before steering the conversation toward something less awkward. So Edmund told her. He told her about the stables at Ravensmoor, built by his grandfather and expanded by his own father, and about the particular breeding program he had begun 3 years ago, before his accident, and had continued since then through careful correspondence with his steward, a capable man named Simon Blackwood, who managed the day-to-day operations Edmund could no longer oversee on horseback himself. He told her about a mare named Juniper, who had produced 3 of the finest foals in the county, and about his ambition, still unrealized, to breed a line of horses that might one day rival the finest studs in England. "You speak of it as though you still ride," Eleanor said gently, not unkindly, simply observing. "I do not ride," Edmund said, "not as I once did, but I can still walk among the stables. I can still watch the foals take their first uncertain steps in the paddock. I can still be part of it, even if I can no longer gallop across the fields the way I did as a younger man." He paused, surprised at his own honesty. "I do not often speak of this. Most people, when they learn I can no longer ride, assume the entire subject must be painful for me, and they change it at once, as though horses themselves might cause me some further injury." "I did not think it would be painful," Eleanor said. "I thought it might be the one subject where you did not have to pretend to be someone you are not." Edmund looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt something shift quietly inside his chest, something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. "You are the first person since my accident who has asked me about my life, as though I still have one worth discussing," he said quietly. "Everyone else asks about my leg, if they ask anything at all, and then they do not know what to say next, so they say nothing, and the conversation dies before it has properly begun." "I find your leg considerably less interesting than your horses, my lord," Eleanor said, with the faintest hint of a smile, "or your opinions on poetry, which you have carefully avoided sharing all evening, despite Lady Sinclair's poet reciting for nearly 20 minutes now." Edmund laughed, quietly enough not to disturb the reading, and found himself, for the length of that poetry evening, entirely forgetting the careful walls he usually kept so firmly in place. They spoke of books, and of Eleanor's childhood in Kent before her parents died, and of her uncle's estate, where she had grown up under her aunt's anxious but loving care. She told him of her fondness for long walks in the countryside, and her frustration with the narrow paths London offered a young woman who wished to move freely without a chaperone hovering at every corner. He told her, in turn, of his own childhood at Ravensmoor, of a father who had died when Edmund was only 16, leaving him to inherit the title far younger than he had expected, and of a mother who had passed only a year before his accident, so that he had faced the worst months of his recovery largely alone, save for his younger sister Charlotte, who had nursed him through the darkest weeks, with a patience Edmund still did not feel he deserved. "Charlotte says I was unbearable," Edmund admitted. "She says I refused to see anyone, refused to leave my room, refused even to speak, for the better part of a month. I do not remember much of it clearly. I remember only that I did not want to be seen, not as I was then." "And now?" Eleanor asked softly. Edmund considered the question carefully before answering. "Now, I find that being seen is not always the terrible thing I once believed it to be," he said, "provided the person doing the seeing does not flinch away from what they find." Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither of them quite named aloud. though both felt it settle quietly into place, like a stone finding its proper spot in a garden wall. The poetry reading ended not long after, and as the guests began to disperse, Lady Beatrice appeared at Eleanor's side with the particular briskness of a woman eager to remove her niece from a conversation that had clearly gone on rather longer than propriety strictly allowed. Edmund rose as gracefully as he could manage, and bowed to them both. "I have enjoyed this evening a great deal more than I expected to, Miss Whitfield," he said. "Thank you for the company." "I expect I shall see you at Lady Pembroke's ball next week," Eleanor said. "I understand, it is to be a rather grand affair." "Then I shall look forward to it," Edmund said, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he meant it entirely. As his carriage carried him home, through the darkened streets of London, Edmund found himself replaying the evening's conversation, over and over, turning each word Eleanor had spoken, the way he had once turned over the small comfort of her first kindness, on the terrace weeks before. He did not know what to call the feeling settling in his chest, warm and unfamiliar, and slightly frightening in its intensity. He knew only that for the first time in 3 long years, he was beginning to imagine a future that did not consist entirely of quiet rooms and careful silence, and the thought both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. Lady Pembroke's ball arrived a week later, and with it came the largest gathering of the season so far, a glittering event that drew nearly every family of consequence in London. Edmund arrived later than most, as had become his habit, timing his entrance to avoid the worst of the crowd near the door, though he knew from long experience that no amount of careful timing could fully spare him from the attention his arrival always drew. He found Eleanor almost immediately, standing near the edge of the dance floor in a gown of pale blue, deep in conversation with a young woman Edmund did not recognize. When their eyes met across the room, Eleanor excused herself from her companion and made her way toward him without hesitation, entirely unconcerned with whatever whispers might follow her, open eagerness to speak with the crippled Earl, in full view of the room. "You came," she said, and there was genuine pleasure in her voice. "I said I would," Edmund replied, "though I confess, I very nearly did not. Large gatherings such as this have never been my particular favorite." "Then let us find somewhere quieter," Eleanor suggested. "Lady Pembroke has a rather lovely conservatory just off the main hall. I discovered it earlier while attempting to escape my aunt's endless introductions to eligible young men she considers suitable." Edmund followed her gladly, grateful for any excuse to leave the crowded ballroom behind. The conservatory, when they reached it, was indeed lovely, filled with the soft green light of moonlight filtering through glass panes and the quiet rustle of exotic plants that Lord Pembroke had collected on his travels abroad. A few other guests wandered among the greenery, but the space was far less crowded than the ballroom, and Edmund felt, almost immediately, the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. "This is much better," he admitted, lowering himself onto a stone bench beneath a large potted palm. "I thought you might prefer it," Eleanor said, settling beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that seemed to follow her everywhere. "Though I confess, my aunt will not be pleased when she discovers I have abandoned the dance floor yet again." "Does she truly disapprove so strongly of our conversations?" Edmund asked. "I would not wish to cause you any difficulty with your family, Miss Whitfield." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, considering her answer carefully. "My aunt worries," she said finally. "She fears that my fondness for speaking my mind, and my fondness for your company, might combine to damage my prospects this season. She has certain hopes for me, hopes involving a suitable match and a comfortable establishment, and she fears I am not pursuing those hopes with sufficient enthusiasm." "And are you not?" Edmund asked, watching her carefully. "I find myself considerably less interested in comfortable establishments than my aunt would prefer," Eleanor said, with a small, wry smile. "I have never much cared for the idea of marrying, simply to secure a position in society. I would rather remain unmarried my whole life than tie myself to a man I could not respect, or worse, a man who could not see me as anything more than an ornament for his drawing room." "A sensible philosophy," Edmund said, "though I imagine it does not endear you to every gentleman you meet." "I have found that the gentlemen it fails to endear me to are precisely the gentlemen I have no wish to endear myself to in the first place," Eleanor said, and Edmund laughed at that, a sound that seemed to come more easily to him with each passing week in her company. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant music drifting in from the ballroom, and Edmund found himself studying her profile in the soft conservatory light, the determined set of her jaw, the quick intelligence that seemed to animate every feature of her face, even in stillness. He thought of the 3 years he had spent believing himself unworthy of anyone's genuine interest. 3 years of quietly accepting that his accident had cost him not only the use of his leg, but any real hope of connection with another person who might see past the cane, and the careful, guarded distance he had learned to keep from everyone around him. "May I ask you something rather personal, Miss Whitfield?" he said finally. "You may ask," Eleanor said. "I cannot promise I will answer, but you may certainly ask. Why do you continue to seek out my company, when doing so causes you difficulty with your aunt, and no small amount of gossip among the rest of London society? You could easily have contented yourself with a single act of kindness on that first evening, and gone about your season without any further involvement in my affairs. Instead, you have sought me out at every gathering since. I find myself wondering why." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Edmund wondered if he had overstepped, if his question had finally pushed against some boundary she preferred to keep private. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and thoughtful. "I think," she said slowly, "that I grew tired, long before I ever came to London, of watching people be cruel to those who could not easily defend themselves, and of watching everyone else stay silent because speaking up seemed too difficult or too dangerous to their own comfortable position in society. I saw it happen to a girl in my own village once, a girl whose family had fallen into debt, and I watched the entire community turn on her, mocking her plain dresses and her family's misfortune, and I did nothing, because I was young and frightened, and did not know how to stand against so many voices at once. I have regretted that silence every day since. When I saw Lord Thorne mocking you at the Pembroke ball, something in me simply refused to stay quiet a second time. So I am, in some sense, a chance for you to correct an old regret," Edmund said, though there was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet curiosity. "Perhaps that is where it began," Eleanor admitted. "But it is not where it has remained. I continue to seek out your company, Lord Ravensmore, because I find you thoughtful and honest, and considerably more interesting than any other gentleman I have met this season, cane or no cane. I do not spend my evenings with you out of pity, or out of some lingering guilt over a girl in my childhood village. I spend them with you because I wish to." Edmund felt something loosen in his chest at her words, some knot he had carried so long he had almost forgotten its weight. "I have spent 3 years believing that no one could look at me and see anything beyond what happened to my leg," he said quietly. "You have made me question that belief more than once these past weeks, Miss Whitfield, and I confess, I do not entirely know what to do with the feeling." "You need not do anything with it tonight," Eleanor said gently. "It is enough, I think, simply to sit here, among Lord Pembroke's rather absurd collection of foreign plants, and enjoy each other's company without deciding what it must mean." They remained in the conservatory a while longer, speaking of smaller things now, of books they had both read and disagreed about, of Eleanor's plans to visit her uncle's estate in Kent once the London season concluded, of Edmund's hopes for the spring foaling season at Ravensmore. It was, Edmund thought, one of the finest evenings he had spent in 3 long years, and when Lady Beatrice finally appeared in the conservatory doorway, her expression a careful mixture of relief and mild exasperation, Edmund felt genuine reluctance at the prospect of the evening ending. "There you are," Lady Beatrice said, addressing Eleanor with the particular tone of an aunt who had spent the better part of an hour searching a crowded house for a wayward niece. "Lord Ashcombe has been asking after you for the last dance, Eleanor. It would be considered quite rude to disappoint him." "Of course, Aunt," Eleanor said, rising from the bench. She turned back to Edmund, her expression softening. "I hope we shall speak again soon, Lord Ravensmore." "I have no doubt of it," Edmund said, and watched her go with a lightness in his chest that he had not felt since long before his accident, a fragile, cautious happiness that he almost feared to examine too closely, lest it prove as fleeting as everything else good he had once believed himself entitled to. He remained in the conservatory a while longer, unwilling yet to return to the crowded ballroom and the familiar weight of watching eyes, and it was there, some minutes later, that he noticed Julian Thorne standing just beyond the conservatory doors, watching him, with an expression Edmund did not much care for, calculating and cold, the look of a man already turning some new scheme over in his mind. Julian Thorne did not approach the conservatory that evening. He simply watched, for a long moment, and then turned and disappeared back into the crowd, leaving Edmund with an unsettled feeling that lingered long after he had returned home and retired for the night. He learned, within a matter of days, exactly what that look had meant. It began quietly, as these things often did, with a whisper here and a raised eyebrow there. Edmund first noticed it at a breakfast gathering hosted by his aunt, Lady Margaret, when he overheard two women discussing, in tones just loud enough to be certain he would hear, the curious matter of Miss Eleanor Whitfield's sudden and rather aggressive pursuit of the Earl of Ravensmoor. "They say she has set her sights on him quite deliberately," one woman murmured to the other, not troubling herself to lower her voice as Edmund passed nearby. "Her family's fortune is rather more modest than one might assume from her manner, you understand. An earldom, even a small one, would represent quite a step up for a young woman in her position." "And he is hardly likely to attract better prospects, is he?" the second woman replied, with a small, unkind laugh. "Given his condition, I imagine he is rather grateful for any attention at all, whatever the lady's true motives might be." Edmund kept walking, his face carefully composed, though the words settled like stones in his stomach. He did not believe them, not truly. Not after the conversations he and Eleanor had shared, the honesty that had passed between them in Lord Pembroke's conservatory. And yet the seed of doubt, once planted, proved difficult to entirely dislodge, however firmly he told himself it was nonsense. He heard the same rumor again 2 days later, at a card party, this time framed slightly differently, suggesting that Eleanor's aunt had orchestrated the entire courtship in hopes of securing her niece a title before the family's dwindling fortunes became public knowledge. He heard it a third time at his club, from an acquaintance who seemed to believe he was doing Edmund a kindness by warning him of Miss Whitfield's supposed scheming. Edmund did not need to guess at the source. The rumors bore Julian Thorne's particular signature, cruel enough to wound, but crafted with just enough plausible detail to spread easily among a society already inclined toward gossip. Thorne could not attack Edmund's leg any longer, not without appearing petty after Eleanor's public rebuke at the Ashcombe ball, so instead he had found a new target, one that struck at both Edmund's fragile new happiness and Eleanor's reputation in a single calculated blow. Edmund found Eleanor at a small gathering hosted by Lady Sinclair the following week, and he could tell immediately, from the tightness around her eyes, that she too had heard the whispers following her through every drawing room in London. "You have heard it as well, then," she said quietly, once they had found a moment alone near the edge of the room. "I have heard it," Edmund confirmed. "I do not believe a word of it, Eleanor, if that is your concern." "It is not entirely my concern," Eleanor admitted, and for the first time since he had known her, Edmund saw genuine weariness beneath her usual composure. "My aunt has heard it too, and though she does not believe it either, she worries constantly, now that my association with you will damage my prospects beyond repair, regardless of whether the rumors are true. A reputation, once tarnished, is difficult to fully restore, whatever the facts of the matter might be." "I am sorry," Edmund said, and meant it deeply. "I did not intend for my company to bring this trouble upon you." "You did nothing wrong," Eleanor said firmly. "Lord Thorne did this, out of spite and wounded pride, because he could not bear to be bested by a woman in front of half of London society. I refused to let him succeed, simply by whispering ugly things behind our backs. And yet the whispers continue, regardless of what either of us refuses," Edmund said quietly. "I have spent 3 years learning how little control I have over what people say about me. Eleanor, I would not wish that same lesson upon you, not when you have done nothing to deserve it." Eleanor studied him carefully, something unreadable passing across her expression. "Are you suggesting that we ought to distance ourselves from one another, Lord Ravensmoor, for the sake of my reputation?" "I am suggesting that I would understand, if you felt it necessary," Edmund said, though the words cost him more than he cared to admit. "I have grown accustomed to being the subject of unkind talk. I would not wish to see you grow accustomed to it as well, not on my account. And what if I have already decided that I do not much care what Lord Thorne, or anyone else in this room, chooses to whisper about me?" Eleanor asked, her chin lifting slightly in the stubborn manner Edmund had come to recognize and admire. "I told you once that I would rather be known for speaking honestly than for staying silent to please others. That has not changed, simply because the gossip has grown more personal. Your aunt worries. My aunt has worried about everything since the day I arrived at her house, at 12 years old, with nothing but a small trunk, and far too many opinions, Eleanor said, and though her tone remained light, Edmund could hear the genuine affection beneath it. I love her dearly, and I understand her concerns, but I will not abandon a friendship I value, simply because a bitter man has decided to spread lies about my motives. That would only prove him right, in the eyes of everyone, who already believes the worst of me. Edmund felt something in his chest ease slightly at her words, though the worry did not fully leave him. Thorn will not stop with rumors alone, I think, he said carefully. A man like that, once thwarted, tends to escalate rather than retreat. I fear he intends something worse before this season concludes. Then we shall face it together, whatever it is, Eleanor said simply, as though the matter required no further discussion. I did not step in to defend you at the Ashcombe ball, because I intended to abandon you at the first sign of real difficulty, Edmund. It was the first time she had used his given name, and Edmund felt the small intimacy of it settle warmly beneath his ribs, even as her words carried the weight of a promise he had not quite dared to hope for. Then I shall trust you to know your own mind, he said, though I confess it does little to ease my worry over what Thorn might attempt next. His worry, as it happened, was not misplaced. Within the week, Edmund received an invitation to a grand ball at the estate of the Duke of Ashcombe's own father, a far more significant gathering than any Edmund had yet attended that season, one that would draw nearly every family of consequence in England, including several members of the royal household. It was, Edmund understood immediately upon reading the invitation, precisely the sort of grand, highly visible occasion where a man like Julian Thorn might attempt something far more damaging than a few whispered rumors, something calculated to humiliate not just Edmund, but Eleanor alongside him, in front of the largest and most influential audience London had to offer. Edmund folded the invitation carefully and set it upon his desk, staring out the window of his townhouse at the grey London afternoon beyond, and felt, for the first time in weeks, the old familiar dread return, coiling tight in his stomach. Whatever Thorn intended, Edmund suspected they would not have long to wait before finding out. In the days before the Duke's grand ball, Edmund found himself increasingly restless, spending long hours at his desk, attempting to answer correspondence from Simon Blackwood about the spring foaling season, only to discover an hour later that he had written nothing at all, his mind occupied instead with thoughts of Eleanor and the uncertain danger that seemed to be gathering around them both. It was his sister Charlotte who finally suggested, over tea one afternoon, that he invite Eleanor to visit Ravensmoor before the season's grander obligations consumed what little peace remained to them. You speak of her constantly, Edmund, whether you realize it or not, Charlotte said, watching her brother with the particular fond exasperation only a younger sister could manage. And you have told me yourself how much you wished someone might see Ravensmoor as it truly is, rather than simply hearing of it second-hand at some London drawing room. Why not invite her to see it herself? It would hardly be proper, Edmund said, though the idea had already taken root, warm and appealing in his mind. An unmarried young woman, traveling to visit a bachelor's estate, however respectable the circumstances. Then invite her aunt as well, and I shall be present the entire time as chaperone, Charlotte said, with the brisk practicality that had carried her through the worst months of Edmund's recovery 3 years before. It is not so complicated a matter as you are making it, brother. You have spent 3 years hiding from the world because you feared how it might see you. Perhaps it is time you let someone see you, as you actually are, in the place where you are most yourself. Edmund considered his sister's words carefully, and 2 days later, he sent a carefully worded invitation to Eleanor and her aunt, proposing a brief visit to Ravensmoor before the Duke's ball, framed as an opportunity for Eleanor to see the stables and breeding program she had shown such genuine interest in during their conversation at Lord Pembroke's ball. To his considerable relief, Lady Beatrice, despite her earlier reservations, accepted the invitation on Eleanor's behalf, perhaps recognizing that a properly chaperoned visit to a respectable country estate might do more to quiet the ugly rumors circulating through London than any amount of avoidance ever could. Ravensmoor, when Eleanor and her aunt arrived 3 days later, proved every bit as fine as Edmund had described. A handsome stone house set among rolling green hills, with gardens that Edmund's mother had cultivated with great care during her lifetime, and stables that stretched along the eastern edge of the property, home to some of the finest horses in the county. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage with unconcealed delight, turning slowly to take in the full sweep of the grounds before her. "It is even lovelier than I imagined," she said, and Edmund, watching her reaction, felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing at all to do with the mild spring sunshine. He gave her a tour of the grounds that first afternoon, moving slowly with his cane along the garden paths, while Charlotte and Lady Beatrice walked a comfortable distance behind, engaged in their own conversation about roses and household matters. Edmund showed Eleanor the stables first, introducing her to Simon Blackwood, who greeted the young woman with evident curiosity, having heard a great deal about her in Edmund's recent letters, and then leading her along the row of stalls to meet Juniper, the fine mare whose foals had brought Edmund such pride these past 3 years. "She is beautiful," Eleanor said, reaching out to stroke the mare's velvety nose, while Juniper regarded her with calm, intelligent eyes. "I can see why you speak of her so fondly." "She was my father's favorite," Edmund said quietly. "He purchased her the year before he died, and I have always felt, in some small way, that continuing her line honors his memory, even though I can no longer ride her myself." "Do you miss it terribly?" Eleanor asked, turning to look at him directly, her question gentle rather than probing. "Riding, I mean. I do not ask to cause you pain, only because I find myself curious about the parts of your old life you have had to set aside." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer honestly. "There is nothing quite like the feeling of a good horse beneath you, moving across open country at full speed, the wind against your face, and nothing between you and the horizon but green fields and blue sky. I have not felt anything quite like it since the accident, and I do not expect I ever shall again." "That must be a very difficult thing to accept," Eleanor said softly. "It was," Edmund said. "For a long time, it was the hardest thing I had ever faced, harder even than the pain of the injury itself. But I have found, these past months especially, that grief for what one has lost does not have to consume every part of a person's life. I can still love these horses, even if I love them differently now than I once did. I can still walk among these stables and feel that I belong here, even if I can no longer gallop across the eastern fields the way I did as a younger man." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, watching him with an expression Edmund could not quite read. "I think," she said finally, "that it takes considerable courage to find a way to keep loving something, even after it has changed into a form you did not choose and would not have wished for. I admire that in you, Edmund, more than I think you realize." They walked on together after that, through the gardens where late spring flowers were just beginning to bloom, and Edmund found himself speaking more freely than he had with anyone since before his accident, telling Eleanor of his father's death when Edmund was only 16, of the sudden weight of responsibility that had settled upon his young shoulders far earlier than he had ever expected, of his mother's long illness in the years that followed, and of the particular loneliness of inheriting an earldom before he had properly learned how to be a man in his own right, let alone a leader of tenants and household alike. "I sometimes think my accident was almost inevitable," Edmund admitted, as they paused beside a small stone fountain near the edge of the garden. "I had spent so many years feeling as though I must prove myself worthy of the title, worthy of my father's memory, that I rode too hard, too recklessly, more often than I should have. My mother used to warn me, in the months before she died, that I would come to harm if I did not slow down and allow myself simply to be young for a while, rather than constantly striving to be the Earl everyone expected." "She sounds as though she understood you very well," Eleanor said gently. "She did," Edmund said. "I only wish I had listened to her sooner. Perhaps things would have turned out differently. Or perhaps they would have turned out exactly the same, and you would simply have spent less time enjoying yourself beforehand," Eleanor said, with a small, wry smile that Edmund had come to treasure, the particular way she had of offering comfort without ever slipping into the soft, careful pity he had grown so weary of these past 3 years. "I do not think it does much good to wonder what might have been, Edmund. I find it far more useful to consider what still might be." "And what do you think still might be, for a man in my position?" Edmund asked, and though he tried to keep his tone light, there was a genuine vulnerability beneath the question that he could not entirely disguise. Eleanor turned to face him fully, the late afternoon sunlight catching the warm brown of her hair, her gray eyes steady and unflinching in a way that Edmund had come to rely upon more than he cared to admit. "I think," she said slowly, "that a man who has learned to love something, even after it has changed beyond recognition, who has found a way to walk among the fields he once galloped across, and still feel that he belongs there, is capable of a great deal more happiness than he currently allows himself to believe. I think you have spent 3 years convinced that your accident cost you everything worth having, Edmund, when in truth it seems to me that it has only made you more thoughtful, more grateful for small kindnesses, and considerably more interesting than most of the gentlemen I have met this season who have never faced any real difficulty at all." Edmund could not speak for a long moment, his throat tight with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. "You have a remarkable way of seeing people, Eleanor Whitfield," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "I have a remarkable way of seeing you, specifically," Eleanor said softly, and something passed between them in that quiet garden, beside the old stone fountain, that neither of them attempted to name aloud, though both understood, in that moment, that whatever waited for them at the Duke's grand ball, whatever cruelty Julian Thorne might still have planned, they would face it together, and that thought alone gave Edmund a courage he had not felt in 3 long years. While Edmund and Eleanor walked among the gardens of Ravensmoor, Julian Thorne was occupied with rather different business back in London. He had spent the better part of a week nursing his wounded pride, replaying the humiliation of Eleanor Whitfield's public rebuke at the Ashcombe ball over and over in his mind, each retelling growing more bitter than the last. It was not simply that she had embarrassed him in front of his friends, though that alone would have been enough to earn his lasting resentment. It was that she had done so on behalf of Edmund Ashworth, a man Thorne had long considered beneath his notice, except as a convenient target for amusement, a man who, by all rights, ought to have accepted his diminished place in society, with quiet gratitude, rather than daring to attract the attention and affection of a woman as sharp and spirited as Eleanor Whitfield. Thorne's resentment toward Edmund, though he rarely examined it too closely himself, ran deeper than mere cruelty for its own sake. He was the second son of an earl, with considerably greater holdings than Ravensmoor, and yet Thorne's own elder brother stood to inherit everything of value, leaving Thorne with only a modest allowance, and the empty title of courtesy that came with being a viscount's younger relation. He had watched Edmund Ashworth, before the accident, inherit his own earldom at just 22 years old, young and whole and full of promise, and some ugly, unexamined part of Thorne had never forgiven him for it, even after fate had seemingly evened the score by crippling the man in a riding accident. If anything, Edmund's continued dignity in the face of his misfortune only stoked Thorne's resentment further, as though the universe had granted Edmund some final, unfair advantage, even in his suffering, the sympathy and quiet respect of those who admired how he bore his difficulty. Now, it seemed, Edmund had found something else Thorne coveted, though Thorne would never have admitted, even to himself, that his interest in Eleanor Whitfield's rumored fortune had never been the true source of his anger. It was her attention itself that rankled, her sharp wit and unwavering confidence, freely given to a crippled earl, while she had offered Thorne nothing but scorn. He gathered his usual companions at his club 3 days before the Duke's ball, a small circle of young gentlemen who had long ago learned that remaining in Thorne's good graces was considerably more pleasant than finding themselves the subject of his cruelty instead. "The Duke's ball will draw everyone of consequence in England," Thorne said, swirling the brandy in his glass with studied casualness. "It seems to me a fitting occasion to remind Miss Whitfield and her crippled earl precisely where they stand in society, before this ridiculous courtship goes any further. What do you propose?" one of his companions, a young baron named Percy Ashford, asked with evident interest. Thorne smiled, the expression not reaching his cold eyes. "I have arranged, through a rather useful acquaintance among the Duke's household staff, to have certain dances called at particular moments during the evening. I intend to ensure that Lord Ravensmoor finds himself publicly unable to fulfill an obligation he cannot refuse, without appearing a coward, in front of the largest and most influential audience London has to offer this season." "And Miss Whitfield?" "I have taken the liberty of ensuring that certain members of the royal household have heard the rumors regarding her family's financial difficulties, and her rather aggressive pursuit of a titled husband despite those difficulties," Thorne said. By the time the evening concludes, I expect both the Earl of Ravensmoor and Miss Whitfield will find themselves considerably less welcome in fashionable society than they currently believe themselves to be." His companions exchanged glances, a few of them showing the faintest flicker of discomfort at the calculated cruelty of the plan, though none dared voice their reservations aloud, well aware of what it cost to fall out of Thorn's favor. "It seems a great deal of effort over a crippled earl and a woman of modest fortune," Percy Ashford ventured carefully. "It is a matter of principle," Thorn said sharply, though even he seemed to hear the hollowness of his own justification. "Miss Whitfield humiliated me, in front of half of London. I do not intend to let that stand unanswered, whatever effort it requires to correct the matter properly." The plan, as Thorn outlined it further over the following hour, was considerably more elaborate than his companions had initially understood. He intended not merely to arrange for an awkward dance, but to orchestrate a moment during the evening when Edmund would be publicly and unavoidably placed in a situation requiring physical exertion beyond his ability, perhaps a request from a member of the royal household itself, difficult to refuse without appearing to insult royalty, and impossible to fulfill without risking a public fall that would humiliate Edmund more thoroughly than any words alone could manage. Alongside this, Thorn intended to ensure that the rumors regarding Eleanor's motives reached the ears of precisely the right people at precisely the right moment, so that her reputation might be thoroughly and publicly damaged before the evening concluded. It was, Thorn told himself with grim satisfaction, a plan that would settle the matter entirely, restoring the natural order of things and reminding both Edmund and Eleanor of their proper place in a society that Thorn believed, with the particular arrogance of a man who had never faced any real hardship himself, existed largely to reward those born to privilege and punish those foolish enough to challenge it. What Thorn did not know, as he laid his careful plans over brandy and quiet malice, was that his own scheme had already begun to unravel in ways he could not have anticipated. One of his companions, a quieter young man named Henry Fitzwilliam, who had said little during the entire conversation, found himself deeply troubled by what he had heard, troubled enough that he excused himself from Thorn's company earlier than usual that evening, his mind occupied with an uncomfortable question he could not quite set aside: whether his continued friendship with Julian Thorn was truly worth the cost of standing silently by, while such deliberate cruelty was planned against two people who had done nothing to deserve it, beyond daring to find happiness in each other's company. Henry Fitzwilliam was not, by nature, a particularly brave man. He had spent the better part of 5 years cultivating Thorn's friendship, precisely because it offered him a certain protection from becoming a target himself, and he understood well enough that crossing Thorn carried real social risk. But as he walked home alone through the darkened streets of London that night, turning the details of the plan over and over in his mind, he found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of Eleanor Whitfield's sharp defense of Edmund at the Ashcombe ball. The way she had stood so calmly against a room full of people who might easily have turned against her for doing so, and Henry found himself wondering, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, whether he might finally be ready to find a similar courage in himself. He did not act on the thought that night, nor the following day. But the seed had been planted, quietly and unexpectedly, in the unlikeliest of places, and as the Duke's grand ball drew closer, Henry Fitzwilliam found himself watching Julian Thorn with new eyes, weighing carefully what he owed to a friendship built on fear, against what he owed to his own conscience, still stirring uneasily beneath years of careful, convenient silence. The night of the Duke's grand ball arrived beneath a sky, heavy with the promise of summer rain, and Edmund found himself standing before the mirror in his townhouse, considerably longer than usual, studying his own reflection with an unfamiliar mixture of determination and dread. He had received, that very afternoon, an unexpected letter, delivered by a servant who claimed not to know its sender, containing only a few careful lines, warning him, without explanation, that Julian Thorn intended some manner of public humiliation that evening, orchestrated to strike at both Edmund and Eleanor before the night concluded. The letter bore no signature, but something in its careful, anxious phrasing suggested it had come from someone within Thorn's own circle, someone whose conscience had finally outweighed their loyalty to a cruel and calculating friend. Edmund had sent word to Eleanor immediately, and by the time his carriage arrived at the Duke's magnificent estate that evening, she was waiting for him near the entrance, her expression grave despite the glittering finery of the evening around her. You received the same warning then, she said quietly, as Edmund made his careful way up the grand front steps. I did, Edmund confirmed. Though I confess, I do not know precisely what Thorn intends, only that we should both be prepared for something unpleasant before the evening concludes. Then we shall face it together, as we agreed, Eleanor said, her chin lifting in the familiar, stubborn set that Edmund had come to admire so deeply these past weeks. Whatever he has planned, I do not intend to let it succeed. The ballroom itself, when they entered, proved even grander than either of them had anticipated, filled with the finest families in England, chandeliers blazing overhead, and an orchestra playing with the particular polish reserved for only the most important occasions. Edmund felt the familiar weight of watching eyes settle upon him almost immediately, though tonight, with Eleanor beside him, the sensation felt somehow less crushing than it usually did. They had not been in the ballroom more than half an hour when Julian Thorn made his move. He approached with two members of the royal household in tow, a young duchess and her elderly companion, both of whom Edmund recognized immediately as figures of considerable social influence, the sort of guests whose opinion could shape a man's standing in society for years to come. Thorn's expression carried none of its usual smirking cruelty, replaced instead by an oily, performative warmth that immediately set Edmund on his guard. Lord Ravensmore, Thorn said, his voice carrying just loudly enough to draw the attention of the surrounding guests. Her Grace has expressed a particular interest in the traditional country reel about to be called. I understand it is a favorite of yours, and I thought you might do her the honor of joining the dance, given your reputation as such an accomplished dancer before your unfortunate accident. The trap was cleverly laid, Edmund recognized at once. To refuse a duchess's request, however carefully worded, as merely Thorn's own suggestion, would appear the height of rudeness before some of the most influential people in England. To accept would mean attempting a fast, demanding dance that Edmund had no hope of completing without risking a public fall that would humiliate him more thoroughly than any words alone ever could. Edmund felt the old panic rise in his chest, the familiar instinct to shrink away, to accept whatever humiliation was coming with quiet, practiced dignity, rather than risk making the moment worse through protest. But before he could speak, Eleanor stepped forward, her expression calm and utterly composed. Your Grace, Eleanor said, addressing the Duchess directly with a graceful curtsy. I wonder if I might make a small confession. I have been rather hoping for the opportunity to dance the reel myself this evening, and I confess I would consider it a great honor if you would permit me to partner with Lord Ravensmore for a rather different sort of dance instead, one better suited to showcase his considerable skill. The Duchess, clearly intrigued rather than offended by this unexpected turn, raised an eyebrow with evident curiosity. And what sort of dance did you have in mind, Miss Whitfield? I understand Lord Ravensmore is a gentleman of remarkable patience and steady grace, qualities that seem to me considerably more impressive than mere speed on a dance floor, Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the small gathering that had begun to form around them. I wonder whether the orchestra might be persuaded to play a slower piece, one that would allow all of us to appreciate the particular elegance a man like Lord Ravensmore brings to the dance floor, rather than measuring his worth by how quickly he can move his feet. There was a murmur of interest among the surrounding guests, and Edmund, watching Eleanor with something like awe, understood immediately what she had done. She had not simply deflected Thorn's trap. She had transformed it entirely, turning a moment designed for humiliation into an opportunity for genuine admiration. And she had done so with such grace and confidence that even the Duchess herself seemed charmed rather than offended. An excellent suggestion, the Duchess said, after a moment's consideration. I confess I have grown rather tired of these fast, breathless reels that leave no room for real conversation or genuine elegance. A slower piece sounds considerably more appealing. She turned to a nearby servant. Please inform the orchestra of the change. Thorn's carefully laid trap collapsed before his eyes, his oily smile faltering into something considerably more strained. Your Grace, I only meant... You meant to offer Lord Ravensmore a kindness, I am sure, Lord Thorn, the Duchess said smoothly, though there was a keen, knowing quality to her gaze that suggested she understood the situation rather more clearly than Thorn would have preferred. I look forward to seeing the results. The orchestra, after a brief pause, began a slower, more graceful piece, and Edmund found himself, to his own considerable surprise, being led onto the dance floor by Eleanor herself, her hand steady in his as she guided him through movements that required careful balance and deliberate grace rather than speed. Movements that Edmund, with his cane set carefully aside and Eleanor's steady presence beside him, found he could manage after all, slowly, imperfectly, but with a dignity that drew genuine admiration rather than mockery from the watching crowd. It was not a perfect dance. Edmund's steps were slower than the other dancers around them, and once or twice he leaned rather more heavily on Eleanor's arm than either of them had quite planned. But there was something undeniably moving in the sight of it. A man who had not danced in 3 years, moving carefully and deliberately across the floor, with a woman who clearly did not care whether his steps matched the practiced perfection of the dancers around them, only that he was there, dancing, present in a way society had long ago decided he no longer could be. By the time the piece concluded, a genuine, spontaneous round of applause had risen from the watching crowd, and Edmund, breathless and flushed with an emotion he could not quite name, found himself surrounded not by the usual whispers of pity or mockery, but by something considerably warmer, considerably more like admiration. Julian Thorne, watching from the edge of the crowd, his carefully laid plan in ruins, felt his humiliation curdle into something far more dangerous than his earlier scheming, a raw, ugly anger that he could no longer entirely contain. Thorne did not retreat quietly. As the applause for Edmund's dance faded and the orchestra began a new piece, he pushed his way through the crowd toward Eleanor, his composure entirely abandoned now, replaced by open, bitter fury. "You think yourself very clever, Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice low, but carrying enough that several nearby guests turned to listen. "Parading your little charity project about the dance floor as though it were some grand act of virtue. Tell me, does it not trouble you at all, chasing after a crippled earl's title while your own family's fortune crumbles behind you? I have heard a great deal this past fortnight about the true state of your uncle's finances." The words landed like a slap, sharp enough that several guests gasped aloud, and Edmund felt a surge of protective anger rise in his chest, sharper than anything he had felt in 3 years. But before he could speak, Eleanor stepped forward, entirely unflinching, her gray eyes cold and steady. "You have heard a great deal, Lord Thorne, because you yourself have spent the better part of 2 weeks whispering these rumors into the ear of anyone willing to listen," Eleanor said, her voice clear and carrying easily across the now attentive crowd. "I wonder how many of the good people gathered here tonight realize that the source of these ugly stories about my family's finances is not some concerned acquaintance, but a bitter man nursing a wounded pride after being publicly embarrassed for mocking a war hero's injury." "I have never claimed to be the source of anything," Thorne said quickly, though a flush of color rising in his cheeks betrayed his growing discomfort. "Have you not?" A new voice cut through the crowd, and Edmund turned, along with everyone else, to see Henry Fitzwilliam step forward from among the gathered guests, his expression carrying the particular strain of a man forcing himself past considerable fear. "I was present, Lord Thorne, at your club 3 days ago, when you outlined the entire scheme to your companions, the dance you intended to arrange this very evening to humiliate Lord Ravensmore, and the rumors you intended to spread regarding Miss Whitfield's family fortune. I did not think, until this moment, that I possessed the courage to say so publicly. I find that I do now." A ripple of shocked murmurs moved through the crowd, and Thorne's face drained of color entirely. "Fitzwilliam, you would not dare." "I would, and I have," Henry said, his voice growing steadier with each word, as though the act of finally speaking had loosened some long-held tension in his chest. "I have spent 5 years watching you humiliate those weaker than yourself, Thorne, and telling myself it was not my place to intervene. I find I can no longer stomach the silence. Miss Whitfield's family finances are her own affair, and considerably more honorable, I suspect, than the finances of a man who spends his allowance plotting cruelty against a decorated gentleman who has done nothing but endure an accident, with more grace than you have shown in your entire privileged life." The crowd's murmurs grew louder now, and Edmund could see, in the faces surrounding them, a visible shift taking place. The polite, careful neutrality that had governed London society's treatment of him for 3 years, giving way to something else entirely. A dawning recognition of exactly what kind of man Julian Thorne truly was, and exactly what kind of courage it had taken for both Eleanor and Henry to stand against him so publicly. "This is absurd," Thorne said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence, cracking slightly under the weight of so many watching eyes. "You would take the word of a woman chasing a title over mine?" "I would take the word of a woman who has shown nothing but honesty and courage since the moment I met her, over the word of a man who has spent this entire season finding cruel new ways to torment a fellow gentleman for an injury he did not choose and cannot help," Edmund said, finding his own voice at last, steady and clear, despite the pounding of his heart. "I have endured 3 years of your particular brand of cruelty, Thorne, and I have said nothing, because I believed, as you clearly intended me to believe, that I somehow deserved it, that my accident had made me less worthy of basic respect and decency. I do not believe that any longer." He stepped forward, leaning only lightly on his cane, and found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he did not feel the familiar shrinking instinct that had governed his every public appearance for 3 years. He felt, instead, a steady, righteous anger, long overdue, and entirely justified. "You have mocked me at every ball this season, for a leg I cannot help, and a limp I cannot correct," Edmund continued, his voice carrying now with genuine authority across the silent ballroom. "You have called me names behind my back and to my face, and you have found, in every room we have shared, some new cruelty to inflict, apparently believing that my misfortune gave you license to treat me as something less than a man deserving of basic dignity. Tonight, you attempted to arrange a public humiliation before some of the most influential guests in England, and when that failed, you turned your cruelty upon a woman whose only crime was refusing to stay silent while you tormented me. I have said nothing until now, because I believed silence was the safer, wiser course. I understand now that silence only ever protects the cruelty, never the person enduring it." The ballroom had fallen entirely silent now, save for the distant strains of the orchestra, still playing on, seemingly unaware of the drama unfolding at the edge of the dance floor. Thorne stood frozen, his earlier bravado entirely collapsed, surrounded by faces that had, only moments before, laughed easily at his jokes, and now regarded him instead with open, undisguised disapproval. "I believe," the Duchess said, stepping forward from where she had watched the entire exchange with keen, careful attention, "that Lord Thorne owes both Lord Ravensmore and Miss Whitfield a rather sincere apology, if he wishes to retain any standing whatsoever in society going forward. I find myself considerably less charitable toward men who spend their evenings tormenting those weaker than themselves than I once believed myself to be." Thorne looked around at the crowd surrounding him, searching desperately for some ally, some sympathetic face among the guests who had once so readily laughed alongside him, and found none. Even his own companions, Percy Ashford among them, had stepped quietly back from his side, unwilling to be associated any longer with a man so thoroughly and publicly exposed. "This is beneath me," Thorne finally managed, his voice tight with barely contained fury and humiliation. "I shall not stand here and be lectured by a crippled earl and his fortune-hunting companion." "Then I suggest you leave, Lord Thorne," the Duchess said coolly, "before your continued presence becomes even more of an embarrassment than it already has." Thorne's jaw tightened, and for one long, tense moment, Edmund wondered if the man might attempt some final, desperate act of cruelty. But whatever remained of Thorne's pride seemed, at last, to recognize the completeness of his defeat, and without another word, he turned and pushed his way through the crowd toward the exit, his usual swagger entirely absent, replaced by the hurried, humiliated retreat of a man whose careful cruelty had finally, publicly, and thoroughly caught up with him. The crowd remained quiet for a moment after he had gone, and then, slowly, the ordinary murmur of conversation began to return, though Edmund could feel, in the glances now directed his way, something entirely different from the careful pity or cruel amusement he had grown so accustomed to these past 3 years. He felt, for the first time since his accident, genuinely and completely seen, not as a curiosity or a cautionary tale, but as a man who had endured a great deal, with more grace than most of the room could likely have managed themselves. Eleanor's hand found his, warm and steady, and when he turned to look at her, he found her gray eyes bright with an emotion that mirrored his own, relief and triumph, and something else besides, something that had been quietly growing between them for weeks now, and finally, in this moment, felt entirely undeniable. "Thank you," Edmund said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "For everything you have done these past weeks, Eleanor. I do not know that I could have found the courage to speak as I did tonight, without your example before me." "You found the courage yourself, Edmund," Eleanor said gently. "I merely gave you the space to discover it." News of what had happened at the Duke's grand ball spread through London society with remarkable speed, though this time, to Edmund's quiet astonishment, the story that circulated bore little resemblance to the cruel jokes and whispered mockery he had endured for 3 long years. Instead, the tale told and retold in drawing rooms across the city concerned a courageous young woman who had stood against a bully before the most influential guests in England, and a wounded earl who had finally found his voice after years of quiet suffering, and a young gentleman named Henry Fitzwilliam, whose belated courage had helped expose a cruelty that had gone unchallenged for far too long. Julian Thorne, for his part, found himself increasingly unwelcome in the very drawing rooms where he had once held court so confidently. Invitations that had once arrived without fail grew scarce, and those hostesses who did still receive him found their other guests considerably less inclined to seek his company than they once had been. Within a month, Thorne had quietly withdrawn from London entirely, retreating to his family's country estate under the polite fiction of needing rest after a demanding season, though everyone who mattered understood the true reason for his sudden absence. Edmund, meanwhile, found himself experiencing London society in an entirely new way. The whispers that had once followed him into every room, cruel and constant, had not vanished entirely, for society rarely changed so completely or so quickly, but they had shifted in character, tinged now with genuine respect rather than mockery, and Edmund found that he could walk into a ballroom without the familiar dread that had governed his every public appearance for 3 years, secure in the knowledge that whatever whispers followed him now were far more likely to speak of his courage than his misfortune. He continued to see Eleanor throughout the remainder of the season, their friendship deepening steadily into something neither of them any longer attempted to deny or explain away as mere companionship. They attended concerts together, and quiet dinners at his aunt's townhouse, and long afternoon walks through the London parks where Eleanor insisted, despite Edmund's occasional protests, that his leg would only grow stronger through gentle, regular exercise rather than the careful avoidance he had practiced for so long. It was at a smaller, quieter gathering some 6 weeks after the Duke's ball, hosted by Lady Margaret Ashworth in the gardens behind her own modest townhouse, that Edmund finally found the courage to say what he had been carrying in his heart since that evening in the conservatory at Lord Pembroke's ball. The garden was quiet that afternoon, most of the other guests having retreated indoors, as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, and Edmund found himself alone with Eleanor, beside a small ornamental pond, the fading golden light catching the water in gentle ripples. "I have been thinking a great deal these past weeks," Edmund said, his voice carrying a nervousness that Eleanor had rarely heard from him since their very first conversation on Lord Pembroke's terrace, "about everything that has changed since the evening you first spoke to me at that dreadful ball, when I very nearly fell upon the polished floor, before the entire room." "I remember it well," Eleanor said, smiling gently. "You were quite determined to insist you needed no assistance whatsoever, if I recall correctly." "I was a fool," Edmund said, "though I suppose I had my reasons at the time. I had spent 3 years convinced that accepting help of any kind was simply another form of admitting defeat, that I must prove myself capable of managing entirely alone, or else confirm every unkind thing Thorne and his companions had ever said about me. You showed me, over these past months, that accepting help, accepting kindness, accepting the genuine care of another person, is not weakness at all. It is, I think, one of the bravest things a person can do. I am glad to have shown you that," Eleanor said softly, watching him with an expression of careful, gentle attention. "I have also come to understand," Edmund continued, gathering his courage carefully, "that I do not merely value your friendship, Eleanor, though I value that a great deal. I find that I have come to love you, quite completely, and quite against my own careful expectations of what my life might still hold after my accident. I did not believe, 3 years ago, that I would ever again find myself standing before someone I loved, hoping desperately that she might return the feeling. I find myself standing here now, and I can only hope that I have not misjudged what has grown between us these past months." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and Edmund felt his heart pounding uncomfortably as he waited for her response, wondering if he had, after all, misread the warmth and steady affection she had shown him so consistently since that first evening. "Edmund," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion she made no effort to hide, "I have loved you, I think, since that evening in Lord Pembroke's conservatory, when you spoke of your horses with such quiet passion, and I realized that beneath the careful, guarded man society had convinced itself to see, there existed someone thoughtful and honest, and considerably more worthy of genuine affection than any other gentleman I have met in my entire life. I did not step forward to defend you at that first ball out of mere sympathy for a stranger's misfortune, whatever I may have told myself at the time. I believe, looking back now, that some part of me recognized, even then, that you were someone worth knowing, worth defending, and eventually, worth loving completely." Edmund felt something break open in his chest, warm and overwhelming. 3 years of careful, guarded loneliness, finally giving way to something he had genuinely believed, after his accident, he would never again be permitted to feel. He reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation, her fingers warm and steady in his. "Then I believe," Edmund said, his voice rough with emotion, "that I have a question to ask you, Eleanor Whitfield, though I confess, I have not yet properly arranged for a ring, having only just found the courage to speak my feelings aloud this very afternoon." "I find I do not much care for rings and proper arrangements," Eleanor said, laughing softly through unexpected tears. "I have never much cared for doing things the conventional way, if you will recall." "Then will you marry me, Eleanor?" Edmund asked simply, holding her gaze steadily, despite the trembling uncertainty in his own chest. "I cannot promise you a life free from difficulty, or a husband who will ever again dance as easily as other men, but I can promise you my complete devotion, and my deepest gratitude, for showing me that a life interrupted by hardship is not, after all, a life diminished, provided one has the right person walking beside them, through whatever difficulties remain." "Yes," Eleanor said, without a moment's hesitation, her smile brighter than Edmund had ever seen it. "Yes, Edmund, I will marry you, and gladly, and I shall spend the rest of our lives together, reminding you, whenever necessary, that you are considerably more remarkable than 3 years of unkind whispers ever managed to convince you." Their wedding took place that autumn, at Ravensmoor itself, beneath the same trees where Edmund's mother had once cultivated her beloved gardens, with Charlotte standing proudly beside her brother, and Lady Beatrice weeping happy tears throughout the entire ceremony. Entirely reconciled at last, to a match she had once feared might damage her niece's prospects, and had come instead to recognize as the truest happiness Eleanor could possibly have found. Julian Thorne did not attend, having remained largely absent from London society in the month since his public humiliation, though word eventually reached Ravensmoor that he had, in time, grown considerably more careful about the cruelty he inflicted upon others, chastened perhaps by the completeness of his own downfall, or perhaps simply by the discovery that society, once it had witnessed genuine courage standing against genuine cruelty, proved considerably less tolerant of bullies than it had once been. As for Edmund and Eleanor, they returned each season to London, where Edmund now walked into every ballroom, not with the old dread of watching eyes and whispered cruelty, but with quiet confidence, his cane no longer a mark of shame but simply a tool he used as easily and unself-consciously as any other man might use his own 2 legs. He danced, when the music suited him, slowly and carefully, always with Eleanor beside him, and those who watched no longer saw a crippled earl to be pitied or mocked, but a man who had faced the very worst that cruelty and misfortune could offer, and had found, in the end, something considerably stronger waiting on the other side of it. A love built not on pity, but on genuine respect, and a partnership that had begun, improbably enough, with one brave woman refusing to stay silent while a bully had his fun at a crowded London ball.